All right, so here we have the female reproductive system. Okay, so the female reproductive system has a little more to it, as not as many names, I would say, so it doesn't seem as complicated from the outset. But unlike the male, where you're really just producing a gamete and giving it away to get to the exterior of the body, in the female, you have to produce a gamete, but you also have to have a place for that gamete to meet the male gamete, and if they meet, then a place for the new organism to start to grow and develop. So as we go through, we're going to see some of these components and talk about them a little bit. Okay, so the first thing, let's get our bearings again like we did last time. So here's the sigmoid colon and the rectum. Okay, here's the urinary bladder. Okay, and so you can see the vagina. This is the exterior surface of the vagina, and the uterus are kind of between those two structures. Okay, so you can imagine this is a non-pregnant uterus. If it was a pregnant uterus, these areas would all be kind of feeling the pinch as this uterus started to grow. Okay. We also have in red here the fimbria, which are the kind of distal tip of the uterine tube. I'll kind of turn this a little bit so you can see the uterine tube there. Okay, and so the uterine tube connects the uterus to the ovary, which is the kind of tan structure that you can see there that has the red line on it. Okay, so that would be the ovary. And this is the ovarian ligament. Oops, sorry. I tilted too far. Okay, so the ovarian ligament is then holding the ovary to the uterus and kind of holding everything in place. Okay, so the idea is, and we can see this on the other side too, here's the ovary, the ovarian ligament, here's the fimbria, and here's the uterine tube. Okay, so the idea is that the ovary, which would be analogous to the testis in the male, is where we're producing the gamete or sex cell. Okay, so this is where meiosis would be happening. And we'll talk a little bit about the stages associated with forming the oocyte in a few minutes. But if an oocyte is ovulated and is thrown out from the surface of the ovary, it will be caught up by the fimbria. Okay, and the same hormones that cause ovulation cause the fimbria to be more active. So they will catch the oocyte that's been ovulated and allow it to move into the uterine tube. Okay, and the uterine tube can also be called the fallopian tube, and it can also be called the oviduct. They all mean the same thing. Okay, now fertilization is going to happen. It's going to happen here in the uterine tube. Okay, here is the uterus. The uterus is where we create the space where a fertilized oocyte or ovum, I guess I should say at this point, and a new organism could come and implant to grow. Okay. We also have this ligament here that we should mention as we're looking at. This is the round ligament, and this helps to keep the uterus in its what's called anteverted state. So you can see how it's kind of draping over the urinary bladder here. It's supposed to be in that position. Okay, so the round ligaments help to hold it in that position. Okay, so we're going to remove this section now so we can see some internal anatomy. Okay, so as we're looking, here's the uterus again. And where you see the pink and red here, that is representing the endometrium, which is the layer of the uterine wall that's closest to the lumen. Okay, so the endometrium is where the embryo would implant if it came along looking for a home. It's also part of it, at least, is what would be shed if a woman was menstruating, if she was in that part of her uterine cycle. Okay, then as we go deeper into the organ, we have the myometrium, which is the muscle layer. And then closest to the abdominal cavity, we have the perimetrium, which is the serous layer of the uterine wall. Here's the internal surface of the urinary bladder with all the folds, the rugae that you can see. Here's the urethra in the female. You can see much shorter than in the male. That's why females are more likely to get urinary tract infections than males. Okay, and back over here, this section of the uterus that is kind of bulging out into the vagina is the cervix. Okay, and then this would be the internal surface of the vagina here. Okay, so let's take a look at an illustration. This is from your textbook. Okay, so here's the round ligament heading away. Here's the ovarian ligament that attaches the ovary to the lateral aspect of the uterus. Here's the ovary, and we're seeing all the different stages of follicle development here. We'll talk about those in a moment. The fimbria, the finger-like structures that catch the oocyte that's been expelled. The uterine tube. Here's the uterus with the endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. Okay, think peri like peritoneal cavity. That'll help you remember this one. Okay, and then here's the cervix and the vagina. Okay, now this extensive ligamentous structure that you see here that has a number of tubes and other structures within it, that is the broad ligament. And you may have noticed looking in your textbook and your lab manual that it has different components that make it up, but the whole thing, which is the term that you're responsible for, is the broad ligament. Okay, and then we also have this membranous structure up here, which is the suspensory ligament. Okay, and that gives you additional support on this side. Okay, here is a view, a more detailed view of the uterine wall. First is a histological image, and then we have the actual drawing over here. Okay, so the endometrium would be basically everything from here to the surface, where you see that little set of yellow cuboidal cells. Okay, the deeper part of the endometrium is the basal layer. This is the part that is not shed during menstruation, and it should be there whether the endometrium is menstruating or not. And it contains stem cells that allow the endometrium to regrow after menstruation. Okay, the other portion, the one that's closer to the lumen, is the functional layer. This is the layer that will receive the embryo if implantation takes place, or it will be shed during menstruation if implantation doesn't take place and no embryo arrives. The next layer in, where you have all these smooth muscle cells, that's the myometrium. And the job of the myometrium is to contract when you're trying to expel something from the uterus. Okay, so that can be during menstruation, to contract to help shed the functional layer of the endometrium, or it can be during labor to contract to expel the fetus into the outside world. Okay, and this big yellow thing that you see here is a gland, and those glands develop from the functional layer as the hormones stimulate more advanced growth of that part of the endometrium. Okay, we'll look at this one quickly. Okay, so we have the uterus, the ovary, it's kind of this greenish color, fimbria, the uterine tube, and the blue covering everything on each side is the broad ligament. This would be the cervix. Here's the vagina. Okay. Last but not least, we're going to take a look at the ovary model. So the model is constructed kind of in a fake way, just like many of the pictures in your textbook are, to try to show you all the possibilities of what could be happening, although you really shouldn't see all of these stages at the same time in a living organism. Okay, so we have the deeper layer of tissue, the medulla, all the fancy parts of the model that you see out here more superficially, those are all in the superficial layer of tissue, the cortex. Okay, so basically the simplest cells that you have here are in the primordial follicles. These are the least developed oocytes. When a child is born, she'll have a collection of cells that look like this, mixed in with a set of cells that are starting to look a little like this. Okay, and all of the oocytes should be in the first prophase. Remember, we're going through meiosis, so we have 2 rounds of divisions, and all of the oocytes should be in prophase 1, and they get stuck there until a young woman reaches menarche, when she starts having enough hormones to grow a functional layer of the endometrium and to have a uterine cycle, and also to produce more mature oocytes and have an ovarian cycle. Okay, now when that happens, you'll see more of the oocytes start to go further in development. You'll see more primary follicles emerge. Okay, and that's what these are when they have 1 layer of cells around them. And then as they mature further, they get more cells around them. And if you have 2 layers or more, that makes you a secondary follicle. And you'll notice how big the oocyte is. It's like, think about a chicken egg, okay, where you have that big yolk in there, where you're storing a bunch of material. That's what's happening with this oocyte as well. It's storing a lot of material. Because remember, the sperm isn't bringing much to fertilization. It's enough that that cell can actually get to the oocyte. The oocyte has to bring all of the raw materials to make that new living organism. The sperm really can only bring the genetic material, so the oocyte has to bring everything else. Okay, so it's stockpiling. That's why it's getting so big. Okay, so our secondary oocyte is going to have these multiple layers of cells around it. And the nucleus is also changing, because in the nucleus we're converting to a cell that's further along. We finish meiosis 1 and we start into meiosis 2 and get into metaphase. Okay, so that's the condition we'll stay in unless fertilization occurs. Okay, so this vesicle, or this follicle continues to develop, and the cells around the oocyte start to secrete fluid, and that starts to turn the follicle into a vesicle or a vesicular follicle. Okay, and ultimately you get enough fluid pressure that the vesicle pops. And when it pops, it throws the oocyte out into the abdominal cavity. And it shouldn't go far, because if the fimbria are sweeping, it should catch the oocyte up and pull it right into the uterine tube, where it may meet up with some sperm. Okay? Now, the follicle that's left behind is going to transform. Okay? And it will go through a couple of different stages, but eventually it will transform into this, which is the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is a temporary endocrine organ. And the job of this organ is to secrete progesterone. It will secrete progesterone for only a short time unless it hears from an embryo. Okay, so let's say this oocyte got ovulated, it didn't meet up with any sperm, it degenerates in 24 hours. There's no one to call the corpus luteum and say, we need you to keep secreting progesterone. So it dies off, converts into a corpus albicans, which is basically like scar tissue, and stops producing progesterone. And that would be the signal to the uterus that it was time to shed the functional layer of the endometrium. Okay, now if the oocyte did meet up with sperm, then it would develop into an embryo, and that embryo would make it to the functional layer, and then it would have to say, corpus luteum, please keep producing progesterone, because otherwise I'm going to get shed along with this functional layer of the endometrium. So the embryo, as it's developing its placenta, will start producing different chemicals, one of which will act as a feedback to the corpus luteum to make it persist. Okay, so this will allow the embryo to keep the progesterone level high so the functional layer stays. So embryo, corpus luteum stays, keeps making progesterone for a while. No embryo, corpus luteum degenerates and converts into the corpus albicans, and no more progesterone. And that's it.